I'm literally going to read directly from the regulations in place in New South Wales. I'm quoting, "Well design and construction must ensure that no leaks occur through or between any casing strings. The fluids produced from the well must travel directly from the producing zone to the surface inside the well conduit, without contamination of groundwater or other aquifer resources, and avoiding leakage." So when we say a well has integrity, it conforms to that mandate. When we say a well has lost its integrity in one way or another, or perhaps multiple ways, it no longer conforms to that mandate. Basically, that means that the well is leaking. If a well is failing, a manifestation is, in this case, of a coal seam well, that methane or perhaps other hydrocarbon fluids are leaking from outside the well. And the risks that that would entail include risk to groundwater. Also, even if the leakage does not find its way into an underground source of drinking water, a private water well, the leakage will find its way into the atmosphere. And every well then becomes a global greenhouse gas emitter. Whenever one drills a hole into a rock mass to access a hydrocarbon, and one then uses the traditional means of establishing integrity, that is a combination of steel casing and cement lining, that whenever that happens, you run the risk of leakage. It is physically impossible to ensure that a well will not leak. To ensure means it will never happen. So there are data in the open literature produced by the oil and gas industry worldwide that chronicle the history of well leakage rates. The data consistently show that regardless of what kind of well we're talking about, regardless of whether the well is onshore or offshore, regardless of whether the well was drilled in the 1970s or in the last 10 years, initially, brand new wells leak at a significant rate. The oil and gas industry seems to be content with leak rates in the single digits, 5, 6, 7, 8% of wells leaking. I find that unacceptable, especially in a situation like you have with coal seam wells, where you're going to have a very large number of wells in a relatively small area. It's also well known from the literature and from the data that the rate at which wells leak increases with age. The life of the well, from the point of view of your regulatory body, is the productive life of the well. Excuse me, but a well, like any constructed asset, can deteriorate with age. The well is not going to disappear when it goes out of production. It's always going to be an underground structure. It's a constructed asset, and it's underground, and as it ages, it's going to deteriorate. So for these regulations to only apply to the title holder during the time that the title holder is making production from that well, effectively says that the rest of the people in Australia who are not making any financial benefit from the well will then have to bear the cost of monitoring and maintaining that well forever. It's important to present regulations in a proper probabilistic framework. If one knows that the risk of leakage is well known, it's the result of millions of wells being drilled around the world and hundreds of thousands of those wells being assessed for leakage, so that one has a huge database. The database says that you should expect about 1 out of every 20 wells is going to leak immediately, because it's really difficult to case and cement a well perfectly. I have spent a substantial amount of time over the last 5 years reviewing existing and proposed regulations for various entities around the world, literally. And so in reviewing all these proposed regulations, I have an opportunity to compare and contrast their strength, their level of detail, their level of acknowledgement of reality. And so I have, at this point, drawn conclusions about yours. And so I'm about to tell you the answer. And before I do that, I want to refer everybody to section G, Roman numeral page number 4, called definitions. And I'm going to read 2 definitions. They're very important. In this code, the words must, ensure, and mandatory indicate a legal requirement. It is essential that operators and other persons responsible comply with these requirements. The next sentence then says, in this code, the word should indicates a recommended course of action. Words such as consider or may indicate matters which may be chosen from options. I have found such weasel words common in virtually every set of regulations I've reviewed in the last 5 years around the world. So let me show you why wording like that leads to absolute nonsense. So I'm looking at section 4.3.4, and I'm about to read something to you. Here it is. It says, title holders should ensure that cement design should avoid cement shrinkage. Now, that is legal garbage. So is it legally required, or is it a should? Is it a must, or is it a should? It's mutually contradictory. If I'm a title holder, I read this and I say, oh boy, loophole. When I compare the overall regulations to those in place, for example, in my state of New York, or in a nearby state of Pennsylvania, the word must shows up much more frequently. In other words, your regulations allow the industry the choice of doing things or not doing things, which in the US, they must do. So there are many elements of these regulations I'm summarizing here, which are far too lenient. They give the operator an option to do something, which in other jurisdictions around the world, they would be required to do. Excellent question, complex. The answer is, in general, no. Your set of regulations frequently refers to the American Petroleum Institute recommended practices. Why would it be referring to the American Petroleum Institute recommended practices if it wants to at the same time say things are different in Australia? Maybe Australians like to think that your coal is different than American coal, or your limestone and sandstone and shales are different than ours, but geology rules. Rock is rock. Third, the one drawing that's in these regulations is a typical cross-section through a typical vertical coal seam methane well. And it looks just like a typical diagram through a typical well in a coal seam in the United States. I don't see any major differences between what's happening to produce methane from coal beds or coal seams in Australia compared to the coal bed methane that's being produced in Canada or the United States. But there is a huge difference, very important difference, between a coal seam well and a shale gas well. A shale gas well, by regulation, can be no shallower. That is, the shale in which that you're trying to get methane can be no shallower than 700 meters below the lowest level of drinking water. That is, for all the regulations in the US that I know of where there is shale gas being developed, it's an unconventional development, you have to have at least 700 meters of rock between the layer from which you're extracting your hydrocarbon and the nearest drinkable groundwater. In coal seam methane wells, in coal bed methane wells, they're usually much shallower. And the height difference, the number of meters of rock between the coal and your groundwater is much lower. That means the risk of contamination is much higher. Coal bed methane wells, coal seam methane wells are more risky from the point of view of contamination of drinking water because of methane migration than are shale gas wells, because of that very important difference. I hope I made that clear.